Now I should tell you what my instructions were for tonight. It was to speak for about 15 minutes and be really smart and provocative. I'm going to give you a little bit of relief. I will not speak for 15 minutes. You've been on your feet far too long without food and drink. That would be cruel and inhumane, and I don't do that. Much shorter, and it probably won't be all that smart or provocative. But I did want to take the opportunity tonight not only to celebrate the launch of the Hub, which I think is an extraordinary idea for reasons I'll come back to in a moment, but to be reflective for just a moment about what I see as the key piece of the puzzle that this initiative can really contribute to. And of course we talk about trying to prevent the conflicts in the first place if we can. That's a big picture macro political issue. The second dimension, it seems to me, is about protecting the human rights of people in places that are prone to conflict. And the third piece, which I want to emphasize is equally important, the refugee side, that provides an escape valve to get out if and when the conflict prevention doesn't work and the Human Rights Project fails to succeed as well. And all three pieces are critically important. I wanted though to pause a little bit and reflect on the second piece of this, the human rights, idea of human rights that underlies, one hopes, the values that this hub will promote. Because I've become very concerned in recent days that all of us talk about human rights as though we know it, we understand it, and we assume that everybody believes in human rights. Who doesn't? It's the new motherhood. It's like puppies. Who doesn't love it, right? But in truth, I want to just, if you will allow me being slightly academic for no more than a minute, to ask you to reflect on whether we really understand what we're talking about when we say that we believe in human rights. It's a pretty extraordinary concept. The idea that there are certain inalienable entitlements that no state, no matter what its circumstances, no matter what crisis it's facing, has the right to breach, and indeed that states have an affirmative duty to make certain entitlements possible, again, even when their circumstances are difficult. And they have an obligation to do that whether you're black or white, male or female, rich or poor. Absolutely the core notion simply of being a human being gives that entitlement. It's a pretty extraordinary notion. There's a wonderful political philosopher known to many of you, I'm sure, Hannah Arendt, who's very critical in her writing of the idea of human rights, which I presume all of us accept. She was thinking about the fact that human rights was really born during the period between the First and Second World War, at least as a matter of law. And yet, we all know what happened shortly after that period, the Second World War and the Holocaust. And reflecting on that, here's what she said, which I think is worth all of us thinking about for a moment. She says, "The conception of human rights, based upon the assumed existence of a human being as such, broke down at the very moment when those who professed to believe in it were for the first time confronted with people who had lost all other qualities and specific relationships, except that they were still human. The world found nothing sacred in the abstract nakedness of being human." And she's right. My worry is that we are still very much at that point. I worry that human rights has become something that we rhetorically embrace without really understanding what we're saying. I mean, you just look around us, 50 years plus after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we see, for example, the systemic deprivation of all civil and political rights to Uyghurs in China. We see the pervasive denial of socioeconomic rights to Roma or Gypsies throughout most of Europe. And in the present moment, I cannot but draw reference to the summary rounding up of tens of thousands of Tamils on the grounds of nothing more than their ethnicity. Denial of freedom of movement, subjection to the well-founded risk of torture, cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment by a government with which Australia is now negotiating to stop the exit of people who wish to flee. Now, do we really get the idea of human rights when that's the nature of the world around us? Here's where I think the beauty of the hub comes in. Sometimes people like me who study human rights in the abstract, and I would lump into that group non-governmental groups, lawyers, well-meaning public servants, and others, think about human rights at far too abstract a level. It doesn't really come home to roost. We don't really focus on its essential meaning because it is just a little bit too academic. The importance of the diaspora communities among us, particularly those of you who have fled conflict and who know firsthand the absolute horror of the violence and breach of human rights that conflict occasions, is that you need to stand up and make visible in this community, through your own experiences, why it is that human rights must matter. It's a little bit like the gay community's view that unless everybody comes out, no one will actually get it. When you actually know a gay person, it's a little bit more difficult to be as homophobic as you might otherwise be. The same is true here. We hear people on the radio right now saying, why doesn't everybody just sit in Sri Lanka and wait for the conflict to be solved? Right? Why isn't it right that the government simply circumscribes exit and requires people to proceed in an orderly fashion? And you know the reasons why. You know that the reason is because these people will likely not be alive if we do that. And so I really congratulate the Hub as being a site for the migrant and refugee communities, particularly in Australia, to really come together and help the rest of us learn from experience, to stand in our faces, to insist upon a realization of the critical importance of human rights, and to not let us engage in the kind of abstract debates that far too often have led to complacency among policymakers and to a willingness of voters to forget the real human side of the tragedies that could be stopped. So may I congratulate everyone who's behind the project, the board members, the volunteers, the funders. All of you are doing an extraordinary thing, and people like me who stand on the sidelines far too often and provide nothing more than rhetorical support really are in your debt because you're doing the hard work that needs to be done. So thank you very much, and congratulations on a great initiative.